my water's ready to go.
Do you want me to click her through the slides? Just right now.
Yeah, you can go ahead. Whatever.
All right, we're going to get started. It's right now. All right, so we're going to get started. Thank you guys for coming out. And how many people, this is their first meetup for Columbus Web Group Meetup? Cool. Awesome, awesome. It's great to see new faces. My name's Kevin.
I'm Adam.
And we're the organizers of Columbus Web Group. This group Adam started now about a year and a couple months ago, and it continues to grow, so it's really awesome to see new faces out here. So we just have a couple of announcements that we want to put out there and talk about our upcoming events.
Yeah, so Kevin mentioned we've grown to over 500 members in just about the past year, which is awesome. So glad you guys are all so into the community and make it out for these things. We've got a bunch of really good presentations scheduled for this upcoming year. New education and different events. We're definitely looking for volunteers to kind of help us out and spread some of that workload because it does take a little bit of effort to put this stuff together. And then T-shirts. We did make some T-shirts, which I think we're just going to give them to the speakers for right now, or maybe some.
And if anyone's interested in maybe putting out a design for a T-shirt, because we need to kind of make some money just for putting on some of these events. Not looking to make money personally off this,
it's not free, though.
But for just organizing and putting these all together, they do cost money. So looking for ways for us to bring in some money and keep this going and growing. So if anyone wants to help us out with anything from some of the tech stuff, setup, volunteering, even maybe throwing some ideas together for T-shirts or anything that we could sell. Anything else? That's it. All right. For upcoming events, our next one is February 11th, and the presentation is by Brad. Is it Colbo? Colbo. And he's a UI UX designer from Cleveland. He's a really, really awesome guy. He's really into comic strips, and he's actually doing a presentation about creating user-centered design and relating it to comic books. And he he's a co-organizer of a group similar to Columbus Web Group in Cleveland. It's called the Cleveland
Web Standards
Association. Yeah, and then he also runs an annual conference, and that's a really awesome one. Yeah. And Brad was featured in .NET Magazine for his comic book strip called The Brads. So, I don't know. Brad's a really awesome guy. And then in March, we're doing a meetup with our partners over at IXDA. We're still working on some of the details with that, but we'll be putting all this up on Meetup and trying to figure out what the topic will be and who will be presenting. And then for today, I just want to say thank you to Cardinal Solutions for sponsoring this event. So the pizza, the beer, letting us use their space, which is really awesome.
And all the chairs.
Oh, and all the chairs, yeah.
I should all be standing.
And the projector. So as we mentioned with looking for volunteers, we're also looking for topics and presenters. So we're really, really open up to any ideas, and Adam and I like to try to meet as many people as possible at every meetup, and I feel like we have a good grasp of the type of topics people want. So if you have a topic, reach out to us. You can either contact us through meetup.com, through Twitter at CBEST Web Group, and then there's also this really crazy URL But we'll be tweeting that out and putting it on meetup.com. And if you go there right now, you can actually submit a topic and see what other people have submitted. And
yeah, even if you don't want to speak about the topic, you can even suggest that we could reach out and find people here local that would be interested in talking if it's not you. So.
Yeah, and Adam and I totally dork out about presentations. So even if you've never really done a presentation, we can help you put together like your abstract outline, form it. So whatever you want to do, reach out to us. This is yours.
So yeah, this was one quote. I was just kind of thinking about the whole idea of accessibility and usability, and just kind of Googling around. I found a quote that I think sums it up pretty well, that the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone regardless of disability is an essential aspect. That's the guy that created the internet, so he knows what he's talking about. So, yeah, that's it.
So we can continue doing announcements and talking about Columbus Web Group, or you guys can listen to Brian talk. So,
as well as I can.
yeah, and side note, I'm speaking for Brian. He's kind of losing his voice a bit, so he's going to do his best to project it as loud as he can. So, yeah. So
if you're in the back and you can't hear, don't be shy. Come on forward.
All right. So Brian Greene. There we go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kevin, Adam, and the Columbus Web Group. So my name is Brian Greene, and I'm a creative technologist at Nationwide Insurance. So what a creative technologist? It's a new group inside the user experience department, and what creative technologists are responsible for is creating HTML, CSS prototypes in order to support user testing, as well as now that we are delivering our design specifications to our IT partners, not in PDF design specifications, but actually in markup in HTML and CSS. And a big part of what my job is to be able to also communicate that accessibility to our IT partners. So, well, what I'm going to talk about today goes a basic overview of what disabilities and what accessibility is. Basic guidelines is kind of level set with everyone about some basic things that you could do to improve your accessibility. And then we'll dive into the modern web, and that's really what the guts of the conversation's about. Icon fonts, SVGs, single web page apps, and responsive web design. And at the end, I'll finish with tools and some websites that you can access. So, has anyone ever heard of Bobby Approved? Back in the day, anyone? A couple, maybe? All right, yeah. So, Bobby doesn't exist anymore, but Bobby was a website back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Excuse me. That you could put your URL into, and it would scan your website, check for accessibility, and then you get these awesome little checklists that you can put at the bottom of your web page. So, even though Bobby's gone, the idea has lived on. So let's talk about some of the overview of the different types of disabilities. So what type of disabilities are we talking about? So there's visual. It's not always blindness. It could be low vision, partial sight, color blindness, things like that. Auditory, deaf. It's not as, I'm not saying it's not as important, but in the web, it's typically very a visual experience, right, except for video. And we'll sort of talk a little bit about how video and how you can help accessibility with audio. Auditory, cognitive, and neurological. So this is a little bit more challenging because the way that dyslexia, those types of disabilities are a little bit more challenging to address, at least through technology, right? It's through writing, and there's things that we can do, but it's a lot of it's out of our hands. And then physical, motor disabilities, right? And so those could be temporary or permanent. So if someone's lost the use of their hands or limited, they don't have quite the fine motor skills to use a mouse, they might be using the keyboard primarily to navigate the web instead of a mouse. So examples of disabilities and changing abilities, health conditions, right? So here I am unexpectedly, challenging to speak. Glasses, right? Our vision starts to deteriorate over our lifespan. So my mother, she doesn't view the web at the normal size, right? She hits the control plus a few times, right, in order to expand the text so she can read it better. Situational limitations. So those are things like we were testing a website in Maryland, and one of the participants came in, and he had been in, I don't know if it was an accident or he had some sort of temporary condition where he just really couldn't use a mouse anymore. And so he said, you know what, I use my iPad for almost everything now. So those are those situational type things where you might, it might be short term, or it might be long term, but you might not use the device that you're typically used to. So let's talk about some of the governance and how you might gauge your success around accessibility, right? So the WCAG, so this is came up through the W3C, and there's 3 levels of compliance: A, AA, and AAA. And it's funny that even their own website says that AAA really isn't possible. You really can't get a AAA rating because of the way that they kind of grade things. And so AA is typically about the highest that you would expect. So if you're not AAA, don't be surprised, because even they say it's almost impossible to get. It's not legislated here in the United States, but it is in other countries. So around the world, including Canada, this is a legislative piece of compliance, but here it's not. So these are just recommendations. And you've probably heard, if you've looked into accessibility, you've probably heard of Section 508. And 508 requires government entities to be accessible, which is interesting. So, contrary to what you might believe, public sites don't necessarily have to adhere to this. That this was added to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 in order to make government entities accessible, but it doesn't necessarily apply. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't use it as a guideline, right? So let's look at the mobile screen usage over the last 4 or 5 years, and we've seen that it's jumped from around 12% is where it started back in 2009, and all the way up to 82%. So of those with disabilities, they're starting to use these mobile devices. And if you, in interviews and things, you'll hear that those with disabilities, they absolutely love their phones, right? It gives them, and there's that new website, I think it's Be My Eyes, if you've heard that new app, that, so there's ways that we are improving our accessibility every day. So this is it's our responsibility, not their slide, right? So this is a survey that goes out about every 18 months by WebAIM, which is it's webaccessibilityinmind.org, and I'd highly recommend checking out the site. I mean, it's probably one of the best on the internet around accessibility. And they put out the survey to those with disabilities and sort of asked a number of questions. And this one really, I thought, was very, very telling, is that it's not that we need better assistive technology, it's that we need better websites, right? It's our responsibility to build more accessible websites. It's not on them to build more better assistive technology. So very popular websites, and something that these all have in common is that they've all been sued by various organizations for not complying with not having an accessible website. So Target was a very famous one. If you remember, I want to say it was probably about 10 years ago now that they got sued, and they were because the ADA. So it was determined that the ADA compliance applies to websites when they act as a gateway to a brick and mortar store, right? So a brick and mortar store has lots of rules around accessibility, and so Target, because of their website was not accessible, that they were successfully sued. And not in a bad way, I don't think, right? So I don't think that sue is necessarily a bad thing. Netflix was another one, and all videos that stated that all videos must have captions by 2014, right? So about a month ago, right? So I was thinking, well, do you think they hit the mark? I wasn't really sure, right? So Googled it, nothing. Everything was from 2012 when Netflix was sued and they had to have everything ready. So I turned to Twitter, and this is what I found. So a number of Twitter users sort of posted screen captures of captions that Netflix was putting on their shows. And so hospital worker, black nurse, singing in French. And so I think this is a good example of a company that they met the rules, right? I had to have captions, but the implementation, it doesn't help anyone, right? And so, and my favorite's the log crackling is sort of the closed captioning on that particular one. So starting with the basics. So accessibility means designing a user interface that's effective, efficient, and satisfying for more people in more situations. That's what we're trying to achieve. If you take away one thing from this, I hope it's that this particular quote really hit home for me, and I hope that you take it to heart, is that it's not about the technical aspects of accessibility. That's really easy to achieve, but it's usable accessibility. And that sort of clarifies the difference between minimal accessible standards and something that's actually usable. So you can meet all the requirements that you can get the Section 508, and you can say, yes, I've met all these requirements. But if you sat someone with a sight impairment in front of your website, would they actually be able to use it, right? So ARIA landmark roles. Has anyone who has heard of ARIA? Maybe that's a good. About half or so. Awesome. Okay, so ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. Hey, awesome, right? That's exactly what we're trying to do. So these landmark roles, if you imagine that someone with a sight disability who's using a screen reader, they're going to navigate the site not that differently than how we do, right, as a sighted user. We're going to go through, and we don't read every single link, right? We don't read every single word. We scan the page. And there's no different, right? And they even have more of a need to be able to quickly scan the page, find out where they are. So these landmark roles give some context to what they're looking at. So if you have a role of navigation really helps them identify, because the screen reader is just going to say, list of 5 items. Well, okay, list of 5 items. They don't know if they're in a bulleted list or what their situation is. So adding a role of navigation gives a prompt to the screen reader to say it announces that you're in navigation. Content info is in the footer. So these are the particular roles that you'll want to assign if you're using HTML5, and even if you're not, you can put these roles on divs. But be cognizant of it and be thoughtful about these roles, because it will have an impact on the screen reader and how they navigate your website. And this is one that it's easy to do, and as long as you are having an English-speaking website, this is pretty easy that you want to tell the screen reader to use English as the default language. Semantic headers and structure. So using your H1s, H2s, H3 appropriately. Again, they're going to be navigating through. And these screen readers give the option of being able to navigate in various ways. They can go through all your headings, they can go through all your links, they can navigate through your landmark roles. So there's a number of ways that they can traverse your page, so you want to use your H1, your H tags appropriately. And here's something that, again, so imagine if someone's using a screen reader and they just want to get through your links. And I think we're guilty of this too, is imagine you just had a learn more. So you had a section about us, right? And you have some stuff about your company, and then you have a link that says learn more. If they are just traversing through the links, they have no idea, they have no context as to what am I going to learn more about, right? Because they don't have that sight visual on the context of what is this link associated with. So what we've started to do is add a class called Semantic, which basically what we do is just do sort of the famous, I think, position absolute negative, 999 EMs, right? We're throwing it off the page. But what that does is that it doesn't affect the visual presentation of the page, but the screen reader will still read it. So we're going to say learn more about flexible solutions, right? So that gives the screen reader, it will learn more about flexible solutions, but about flexible solutions won't be visible on the page. And this is a huge one, and this is something I was guilty of until just a couple years ago. And it's focus state. So I was guilty of always just giving a hover state to my links. So what the problem with that is that if someone's only using their keyboard doesn't activate the hover state of a link, right? It's the focus. So what's really important here is that, so we've started doing this across the board, is making sure that not only anytime you have a hover, you also need to have a focus in order to, so this isn't just for, this is almost less for screen readers and more for someone who's just a keyboard user, someone who's got a physical disability that they're not using their mouse. As you're traversing your site with your tab key, you need to know where you are on the site. And if you don't have focus, they have no idea where they are. And this is sort of the, the basic, alt text, right? This is what everyone sort of thinks about, I think, first about accessibility. And I purposely didn't add it first because I think it's important, and I wanted to make sure that we I want to talk about it though. And one thing that I want to make sure that you pull away is like, don't begin with the alt text, a photo of or picture of, because the screen readers actually do that for you. So you want to say a picture of George Washington because the screen reader will say picture of George Washington. So you want to be very deliberate about your alt text and not necessarily, you don't need to add that extra context. And it is okay to use an empty alt tag for something that is meaningless, because now you're just going to be frustrating them that they're going to have to traverse through alt tags that really don't add any value to them. So forums, this is a big one. For nationwide, we have a lot of forums across our site, and this is something that I see probably the most problems with, and especially if forums are being developed by back-end developers, Java developers, and someone who doesn't have a lot of front-end experience and doesn't quite understand how these need to be structured. This causes problems. So every input should have a label with a for, and the for is tied to the ID of that input. And I'll show you an example of a radio button here in a second, but this is a text field. And so if you don't have that label, the screen reader will go into that input, and it'll just say input what? I have no idea, right? You need to be able to announce, you need to create that correlation between the label and the input. If you have a required field, you use ARIA required equals true, because again, a sighted person, the screen reader is not going to read that asterisk, and they're going to have no idea what that means. They're not going to know that it's required. So adding ARIA required equals true will announce to the screen reader that that this particular input is required. The other thing is that screen readers currently don't announce placeholders. So if you don't have a label, and you just have a placeholder, you use the placeholder tag, it's not going to be announced. You want to also use the title, and the title tag will be announced in lieu of the placeholder. So along the same lines, as this is a radio button, you want to make sure to use your legend. And again, you want your label and your input, right? You want those to be tied. The for, you have your ID that's tied to your for is tied to your ID. So those are, it creates that relationship. And the other advantage of this is that this allows, if someone clicks on the label, the words, it will actually activate that radio button or checkbox. So they don't actually have to physically click on the checkbox itself. They can click on the label and it will activate it. Lastly, let's talk about color contrast. So this is something that, for color blindness, this is important. And being able to, if you're using text over images, this is really important that you meet a 4.5 to 1 ratio. And that sounds a little meaningless, I guess, but what it is it's the relative luminance of the text. And how you identify or how you rate yourself and how you're able to actually identify that is there's a couple websites, right? And there's tools out there, I think for Photoshop, and there's websites that you can upload your graphics to, and they'll tell you if you're meeting the color contrast requirements. So the best thing I can do as far as just these general things is test, right? So use a screen reader, and I'll point you to a couple free screen readers at the end. And there's really there's no reason why you do. JAWS is one of the most popular ones that maybe you've heard of before, but it's like $1,000. I think it only works on PC. The Macks are awesome. They already have a built-in screen reader for free. All you have to do is turn it on. There's free options for PC. Test using only a keyboard, right? So put your mouse away and try to see if you can navigate your site, know where you are on your page, only using a keyboard. Make sure that you can navigate your site. And if you have the opportunity, test with users that have sight disabilities or motor disabilities, right? So if you have that option, that's the best case scenario, is being able to bring people in and actually use your website. And I would say that, at least do it once, right? If you can't do it on every project, do it once so that you see how they use it and how someone using a screen reader is very different than you'd ever imagine. They are so quick, you can hardly keep up because they're so used to it that they just they just fly through, and it's awesome to watch. I really encourage anyone to do it. All right, so let's dive into modern web. Does anyone have any questions first? Yes. No, actually, it doesn't hurt. It's frustrating because it doesn't hurt at all. That good? All right, so we'll start with icon fonts. So Filament Group is one of my favorite websites, and we have to take a little more care than just popping a font face block into the CSS and calling it a day, right? So we need to be deliberate about how we use these. So when would you use icon fonts? Sometimes you'd use it just as decoration, right? It's supplementing the text. So in our favorite hamburger, maybe you actually decide to say menu next to it, right? Or sometimes maybe you don't. Maybe you just have the hamburger button there. And we won't dive into the pros and cons of each of these, but let's say that you've decided to use an icon font, for the famous 3 lines, right? So what do we want to have happen? We want the screen reader to ignore that symbol. We don't want it to read that symbol because it's meaningless in this context of being a decoration. But when it's standalone, we need to be able to give it a meaningful description. So this is a popular font library, icon font library that you can go out to the website and you can download. And I want you to listen to the failure that kind of happens here, right? So this is what can happen if you don't do it quite right. So do you hear what it's doing? Oh, sorry. So what it's doing is it's saying A, B, C link, right? Because what they've done is they've tied their icon font to a letter, A, B, C, D, right? And so they were taking that, if they wrap the way that they've wrapped it, in the link they add a class, and they say C is the edit, D is the cloud. So this is completely unusable to anyone who isn't sighted. So what can we do, right? It's relatively easy. So in situations where you don't want the screen reader to actually read it, right? It's just decoration. You can use an ARIA hidden true. So this means that it will not be read by the screen reader. And then what you're doing is you're actually in your CSS, your data icon, and you're giving it the symbol, and you're linking to your font family is your custom icon fonts, right? This Speak None isn't really well supported by screen readers right now, so it's sort of a nice to have. But really, the 2 key takes away is you see this is empty, right? So it's injecting that, but it's not going to be read by the screen readers. So on the flip side, we have a icon. If you remember over here, the standalone, right? We need to be able to read it, right? So that solution that we just came up with, it will read nothing. What do? We add that semantic tag again, right? So span class is semantic, and we're giving it the label of menu. And then we're positioning it off the page. So now the screen reader will read menu in that context in order to give a meaningful description of what that icon means. So we have 2 different options, 2 different use cases for icon fonts and how you might be able to address either of those. All right, SVGs, any questions on icon fonts? Okay. So SVGs are pretty cool. I'm sorry guys. Is that the one that uses ligatures? Yeah, so we've, the funny thing is that I've only used it where I turn on the screen, I went to their website and turned on my screen reader to see how it would go. And the funny thing is that they have that the auto advancing sort of the banner where they're actually demonstrating it. So I was never actually able to get through it. So I haven't had a chance to be able to download it, but I think it's going to work well. My understanding is that screen readers aren't just necessarily reading the DOM; they're actually looking at the page. That's how you're able to affect. CSS is able to affect that. And so if you have a display none in CSS, the screen reader's not going to read it. Even though it's in your markup, it's not going to be read. So it does understand that. So, but I think it is something that has some opportunity. Yeah. So using ARIA labeled by, you mean, or yeah. There's ARIA described by, and I've used that for, like if you use hint text on a form, if you have your label like date of birth, and you have your date of birth form, and you have like MMDD, YYYY, you can say ARIA described by, and you can link your label with your hint text so that that relationship gets created. Ways that you can keep it on the page. I'll have to think about it. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but you know, typically there's a number of ways that you can kind of get things off the screen, right? But if you do a display none, it won't be read by the screen readers. That's why we have to use that technique of throwing it off the screen so the screen readers still read it. Anything else? All right, SVGs. So we're fortunately that you know, SVGs is actually a fairly large and well thought out component, right? So awesome. That doesn't mean it just works right out of the box. And we'll talk about some guidelines that you might want to follow. So you still want to provide text equivalents for graphics. Don't rely on color to convey. If someone's colorblind, they may not be able to see it the way that you expect them to. And you want to ensure your dynamic content's accessible. So we'll sort of talk about some different ways that you can do that. The cool thing, and this is why I think it is accessible, is that it's scalable. So people with less than 20/20 vision, right? So if someone has a vision impairment but isn't completely blind, and someone who really pinches and zooms and be able to, you know, gets really close, they're going to get that crisp image because it is an SVG. And I will say that I had seen that you know, someone who is not completely blind, but, you know, like 90% legally blind, what they were doing was they would actually hold their device about like an inch from their face, and they were able to really zoom in because they still had some sight, but they had to keep the device so close to their face in order to actually make it out. So SVGs are a great option for this, for scalability. So here's an example of, and this is simple, right? Because everyone uses SVGs a little bit different, but I just want to give you a primer on how you might be able to make your SVGs more accessible. So in this case, I have the word content, and what I'm showing here is that because I have the word content, I actually want to use the text element inside the SVG, right? I don't want to necessarily, I don't want to use like, you know, ligatures and whatnot. You know, it needs that, you know, we can actually use the text tag inside SVGs. And this is huge, right? So this is something that, you know, you can immediately do and make a big impact on your SVG files, and sort of what we were talking about labeled by. So, so this particular SVG is labeled by the title, and it's described by the description. And this title matches this, and the ID and ID. So you're creating that relationship, that one-to-one relationship. Because again, if I don't have sight, I have no idea what this image is, right? I have no idea other than it says content. And I will be able to hear that it's content, but I have no other reference on what I'm looking at. So the title, circle with rectangle, I'm even going to describe it more, saying a red circle on a green background. So those are two things that, you know, you can immediately add to your SVGs and add a lot of value for those that need to be able to have assistive technology. And again, the other thing is if you have a link, if you have an interactive SVG and you've added some interactivity, make sure to actually make it a link. And when you do that, the screen readers, as you're navigating through, will be able to pick that up, and you will be able to interact with your SVG. So it's pretty cool that you're able to actually read text and navigate links inside of an SVG through your screen readers. So that's a huge plus. And that's all I have on SVGs, because I know that they can get insanely complicated, right? Go ahead. One more time, I'm sorry. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it's tied to the ID. It's not tied to the tag name. I'm sorry, I just got to use, so I could have put foobar here and foobar there, and it would have, it's creating that relationship to the ID. Same as labels, right? So labels are for, and what you're for is you're tying it to the ID. So again, it's that importance of only having, having one ID per page, right? You make sure all your IDs are unique. And we've had situations where we actually had a radio button set that was being generated through a database, and it was looping through, and someone kind of forgot to increment the IDs. And so you could click on any of the labels, and it was always activating the first radio button. So it's easy to kind of, make those mistakes. And it almost, we caught it in the very last stage of testing. It almost made it through, and that would have been kind of disastrous, I think. If you're clicking on the bottom label, and it's activating the very first input. So you got to be careful with it, especially when you're iterating through. Make sure if you're creating IDs that you increment those so that they are unique. Anything else on SVGs? All right. SPA, single page web app. So I'm not gonna get specific into Angular. There's Backbone. There's Ember. There's a lot of different of these technologies that are out there right now. These different frameworks. So I'm not going to pick on any of them individually because they all have. It's all about how you implement them, right? But the interesting thing is that they sort of break the expected behavior of the web technology. So up until single page web apps came up, that a link goes to a new page, right? Now we're saying it's going to update the single page. And so that can create problems for screen readers because they don't know that something's been updated if we don't tell them. If you're not cited and you don't see that something's been updated, they have no idea. So let's talk about some guidelines. So pages should have unique URLs and can be bookmarked. This is just basic, not only accessibility but usability. Unique page titles for each page. And this is the important one. Make sure that the user knows when the page has been refreshes. And I'll walk you through some examples of that. And don't forget about your basic accessibility requirements, right? So it's still a website that needs to be used. And so you can't forget about the basics. So ARIA has this role of application. And I'm saying proceed with caution because it probably doesn't have the expected behavior that you think. So what's going to happen with that is that when you use the role of application, it completely disables all of the tabs, the inputs, everything, all the traditional ways of navigating through the keyboard are all disabled. And it's up to the developer to replicate that inside of the application. So the tab key, the space bar, the arrows, all of those have to be replicated again. So I'm not saying you should never use it, but I think that you're thinking of like Gmail. Like Gmail's like that's an application, right? They don't do this, right? They don't add the role of application to their body tag. If you're going to use it very sparingly in just little widgets. I would never put it at the body tag because it's going to be disastrous. So let's talk about keyboard access with a single page app, and I'm sort of not really picking, but I'm using Angular sort of as an example here. Who's written an app in Angular? All right, several. All right. So not sure how often you would ever do this, but just why you should never do this is so we have a div that we attach a click event to, and we're going to change the name. And then you can edit your name, right? So this is a div. This isn't an href. So what's the problem with this? So Chrome has some built-in accessibility reporting. And what you can do here is that what it's telling us is that link of edit name, it's a div. What's a div? It's a group, right? It's not a link. So what do we do, right? So if someone's using keyboard and tabbing through, it's not a link. They're not going to find it. So what can we do? Ideally, you'd still use a button or an href, right? I mean, that's the best case because that's the use of what this is. But if for whatever reason you have to use a div or some other element, you can add a role of button and then a tab index of 0. And what the tab index of 0 is it makes it focusable. So that it, I wouldn't encourage you to try to reorder your tab indexes, right? It's a disaster to be able to, tab index and give a numerical value to every single element on your page. Let the keyboard do what it needs to do, right? Because it's unexpected behavior. But the tab index is 0. It makes it focusable. So now what we can do, again, using that Chrome accessibility, now it's identified itself as a button. So that's huge, right? So if you aren't able to use an href or a button in order for these things, so I mean, really the story is just use HTML elements as they were intended, right? So divs are groups of elements and things like that. They're not really meant for interaction and links. So this is a perfect example. So this is the Virgin America website that just got redesigned 6 months ago, I'd say. And in the UX community, it was a big deal. It was very graphical. It was responsive. It was a single web page, single page app. And but the interesting thing, so Marcy Sutton, if you never heard of Marcy Sutton, she's really big in the accessibility world. She speaks at a lot of conferences, and she sort of shows the problem. And I'll see if everyone can kind of pick this out. And I'll turn it up as much as I can so you can hear. But if you look at the focus, just kind of follow. If you can't hear it, at least follow the black box, because that'll tell you where it's going.
Virgin America. Book. List 3 items. List 6 items. Where we can. Please. Choice tape. Documents. Diamond.
All right. Does anyone see what happened? What was skipped? Round trip, one way, right? So what they've done there is that those weren't, that those were not real radio buttons. That those are like divs with using like the radio button replaces, and they weren't identified as links. And so as that person's traversing through, it completely skips that. So if you're a keyboard user or you're using assistive technology, literally you cannot pick if you're a round trip or a one-way or a multi-city. You're completely out of luck. And I went back to Virgin America about a month ago and tried it again, see if they fixed it, and they hadn't. So I'll continue this, and there's another thing that's very interesting. And see if, we'll kind of talk about it when it's over.
San Francisco, VA, Maryland, Washington, D.C. /DC, Maryland, Jose, Maryland, 1, list deadline for submit. Maryland, ABD, list line level 2. Maryland, Maryland, 0, list deadline for submit. Maryland, ABD, list.
So you see two things that happen there. So first of all, she picked the particular city, and it scrolled her down, but the tab never moved, and so she went back to the top, and she was continuing to navigate through those locations. And the other thing is this awesome spinner thing, right? Oh, how cool it is, but it's completely unusable because they have no idea, is it adult, children, so there's no reference to the screen reader as to what I'm adding or subtracting, right? So at least it said add or subtract, but what? Adults, children, I mean, you have no idea. So this is where I'm guessing if you ran this through like one of the accessibility sniffers and you kind of got a report, it might come back accessible, right? Your site's completely accessible. You're using all the alt tags. You're using these particular things. But until you actually try to use the site, is where it's literally unusable. And so that's sort of the distinction that we talked about the technical, just checking the box. Yes, the site's accessible, versus actually trying to use it with only the keyboard or use it with these screen readers. And now there's really no excuse, right? As I said, I'll show you links to these screen readers. If you're on a Mac, it's built in. It's completely free. You could go in like literally tonight and start checking your sites to see how they hold up on a screen reader. So one thing that we saw was that sort of the page changed, right? They scrolled down, but they had no context that happened. So what's a solution is that we can add a div role of region. And this is the key here, is this ARIA live of polite. And there's various attributes that you can apply to the live. There's assertive, polite, I think there's something called atomic, which is like, so what a polite means is that it's not going to interrupt the flow of the speech, right? So if some other element's being read, polite is going to wait for it to finish. There's assertive, that's going to be the first thing that's read. And I think the atomic literally means it's going to stop everything and go immediately to that. So you can Google that, see what's appropriate for your use case is the best thing I could say there. And if you are using Angular, there is a NG ARIA, I guess plugin is the best way to say that, and there's ways that you can use that. And so I would Google that, and if you are using Angular, and it's something that they sort of built in some of these things for you already, so you don't have to completely write them all from scratch. So that could be a great advantage. Any questions on single-page apps? All right. In the home stretch. So responsive web design. So the cool thing is that responsive web design and accessibility are very complementary, but it doesn't mean that just because you have a responsive website that it's automatically accessible. So what are some things that we can do to make sure responsive websites are accessible? So I've seen this more often than I want to admit. So initial scale of 1, maximum scale of 1, and user scalable no. I can't tell you the number of times I've been to a responsive website and there's an image or something and I want to pinch and zoom. You can't do it, right? So maximum scale of 1, you really shouldn't use, right? Allow the user to zoom in as much as possible because you don't know how much they will need to zoom in order to make the site usable for them. It's a user-initiated activity, so they know what they're doing. So allow them to do that, right? So it's like, well, disabling right clicks and don't allow copy and paste and things like that, right? But never, ever, ever say user scalable no, right? So that completely disables all zoom. So if you're going to use maximum scale of like 2 or 3 or 4, but don't ever say user scalable no, right? Because you don't know how they need to use their website, and they might need to blow it up to 800% in order to actually read it. And so Luke W's put this out, and it's talking about minimum control sizes, right? And that's something where we start talking about touch and being able to have larger touch targets. So touch, if you're going touch first, you need to have at least 10 millimeters, right? And it's a little bit hard because of now the DPIs and the way that with Retina, I just can't say 44 pixels, right? Because 44 pixels isn't necessarily that, especially on an iPad mini. Remember, it's a 1024 that gets shrunk down 20% in order to be a mini. So we use more of the metric system in order to do this. But why? Why 10 millimeters? And here's why. So the error rate, if you have a 3.8 millimeter touch target, your error rate's going to be almost 1 in every 3 is going to miss tap, right? But as you see, as the size of the touch target grows down to 11, it's only at 1%. So you definitely want to be in this sweet spot here, which is right in line with what he's talking about, right? 10 millimeters will put you at a very low error rate and a touch target. And how do we accomplish, creating this accessible website? So accessibility, again, I've described a lot of these technical aspects, but now we're starting to, with responsive, we're starting to talk more about the design. If I need to be able to touch and things like that. So what we do at Nationwide is we get a team together that's a front-end developer, a creative technologist like myself, a visual designer, and information architect. And if you see here, we have a desktop, an iPad, a phone. We have all those devices right on hand. And as we're developing, if we can immediately get feedback that, you know what, this button on the phone just doesn't work. We can adjust our media queries if it's too big on the iPad, but too small on the phone. As you start to think, and I know that we don't think too much about devices, but as you're thinking about the use cases, having everyone in the same room so that it's not that telephone game going from designer to creative technologist creating the prototype down to the IT department that's actually building it. We all sit in the same room and we hash out those things early in the process. All right, so tools. And at the end, I do have a URL to all these slides, so you can actually, you don't necessarily need to write all these down, but I'll talk about each of these really quickly. So JAWS is the most popular, but it is a very expensive piece of software. If you work in a large organization and you get really serious about accessibility, and you have the funds and the ability to buy JAWS, I'd recommend it. And we have a number of licenses nationwide that we can actually use. Your free option on the PC is called NVDA, and that's nvaccess.org, and that's only PC. So if you're on a PC and you're looking for a free screen reader, that's actually the #2 screen reader out there behind JAWS. It's NVDA. And the cool thing is it's open source, so it gets updated pretty frequently. Another thing that our accessibility guy wanted to throw in was around extra voices. So if you don't like the voice of NVDA, there's a whole website that you can download different people, and there's probably Darth Vader and all sorts of crazy stuff, right? WebAIM, again, webaim.org. Please check it out, read it. Tons of great articles, tips, checklists, tools. So they have a toolbar that you can install. Contrast checker, I already talked about that. Code sniffer is a great one. HTML code sniffer, and that's a bookmarklet that you just, sort of adds the JavaScript and you drag it up to your bookmark bar. And on any website, you just click it. And the great thing about this is it works behind firewalls and proxies, right? So some of these tools, they have to be on a live site in order for the crawler to be able to access it. But having it as a bookmarklet, I can, if I have a development box, I can actually test our websites before they go to production. I don't have to have a live website in order to check. And see, I was talking about the Chrome accessibility, how I was bringing up those roles of button and groups. If you bring up your web page, go to Chrome accessibility. It's a little bit hard to read. It takes a little bit of time to understand it, but you can find some of those problems built into that. Some mobile options. If you're doing a lot of mobile development, there's a chromatic vision simulator. And what that does is it simulates different color blindness, and there's different types of color blindness, blues and greens and things like that, and that will simulate it. And then Vision Sim is something else that might be a possibility. I haven't tried either of these, but there's possibilities for being able to assess accessibility on mobile. All right, so let's wrap it up. So if you're a freelance web developer or on a small company, what can you do, right? How can you improve the accessibility of your websites? And the awesome thing about accessibility is it's all out there, right? And people are desperate to get this information out, so it's not hard to find, right? Websites, video presentations, go to webaim.org. Just type in accessibility into Google, and literally everything's out there. Build it into your development process. It really shouldn't be. It doesn't have to be an extra thing. Like IE7 support or something like that. I don't want anyone to think about that like that, right? It's just part of you, the way that you do it. And it didn't take me long to get in that mindset. Labels, all those things. As you develop more complicated, more applications for the modern web, it might take a little bit more effort, but you're already spending a lot more effort developing these tools anyway, right? So make sure that they're accessible. And test for accessibility the same as you would as your browsers, right? So if you're testing Chrome and Firefox and IE, keyboard only. Bring out the screen reader to test a few pages. If you're in an agency or a small company, do lunch and learns, code reviews, do some paired programming where you sort of help them out, and then sort of assign maybe accessibility guru. It just, nationwide, as big of a company as we are, we have a handful of people that really understand accessibility. So you don't have to have hundreds of people. It can just, in a small company, it could just be one person that you kind of go to and just kind of get gut checks on. And they can do these lunch and learns and be able to code review for you. And if you're in a large organization like Nationwide, one thing that we're still starting to struggle with is we know it has to be a requirement, but whose requirement? Is it a business requirement? Is it an IT? Is it user experience? Is it our responsibility to create these requirements? And we're still trying to figure that out. It seems to be all three, all combining, but we're still trying to figure it out. If you're agile and you're creating these story cards, one project that I worked on, it was literally on every single story card, is that, you know, that this needs to be accessible, right? So check for accessibility. It's adding it to the test scenarios. And we're Nationwide trying to figure out how to automate accessibility testing, right? But again, it's still that technical aspect. You don't think that you can get away from actually getting a screen reader up and being able to actually use the site. Knowledge sharing opportunities, you know, at Nationwide, a large organization, there's Teaching Thursdays, there's many conferences only for Nationwide, there's tons of opportunity speaking events inside of Nationwide that you can sort of promote accessibility. And that's all I have. And there's the slide, so it's a Google URL. So I'll leave it up for soon. Thank you. So questions?
It feels like this is a lot. So when you're how much extra time? So I'm seeing it as it's developer time. That's it, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Designers have to understand. Feels like a lot to me. So
Yeah.
is there like a certain percentage budget?
I mean, I think I kind of imagine it's sort of like responsive, right? So when responsive came out, everyone got freaked out, right? Because testers, how are we going to test this, right? There's millions of different devices. How are we going to test it? What's the cost impact of this? And yes, it is going to cost a little more, but you're getting that university accessibility, right? Making the website available on all the devices, not necessarily accessible. But I think it depends on the complexity of your application. So if you just have like a marketing website, I mean, it is literally like, I mean, you could probably sit down for an extra day, and like if it's a CMS tool or something along those lines, you could just crank it out really quickly. It does not take a lot of time. But you know, like if you're doing an Angular app or something a lot more complicated, I mean, I know it's a lot, but once you understand it and you just, you know, make it part of your development cycle, I mean, I think it's nominal. It should be like 1 or 2%, right? I mean, if anything. So initially, I'm just throwing out numbers. I mean, I guess I'm not really basing on anything, but I feel like, you know, if you have someone on the project that's willing just to take it on, and like over lunch, I mean, you could come up with there's checklists everywhere. You can just print out that checklist, and it's just adding, you know, a few extra tags, being a little bit more thoughtful about how we do things. Pretty soon, it's like nothing. It's just the way that you do it. Now, around testing, absolutely. And I think that if you have a lot of repeatable components, that's one thing that we started doing at Nationwide. We sort of break down our websites into components. We test those components. We test them for accessibility. Then we don't. If that component's used on a dozen different pages, we've tested it for accessibility, and we know, we know that it should be working across all those different pages anytime that component is being used. I would say that probably testing, if you're going to make a concerted effort about accessibility, and you're really going to try screen readers and keyboards, yeah, I mean, it's gonna cost a little bit more, but you know, I think that the cost of not doing it could be pretty significant. You know, especially if legislation starts coming down more, you know, that it is. So I don't use legislation to scare you to think that, you know, you should, you know, but just the same with responsive, right? I mean, we kind of ignored mobile for a while, right? You know, it didn't really. You know, we're just going to, you know, let the iPhone do what it does. and scale down the site and make it available. But I think that you realize that's not usable, right? It's not, your website's barely usable on a phone. So how do we handle that? We came up with responsive web design in a way that you can make it usable. So I think accessibility is sort of the same way, right? It's simple once you know it. It's the learning curve. It's a little bit steep at the beginning, but literally it flatlines, and it is just so easy to implement and integrate it in your site. So, is that an answer?
Well, the other thing I'm wondering is they put
Yeah, I mean, nationwide, we do work with the state, and we have a large public sector retirement business, and we build websites for municipalities, and there are certain states that we get audited every single year, and they will go in but the onus is more on us, and this is situational, so I don't want to say it's always like this, but the onus on us is to prove the accessibility. I don't believe that they have people actually coming in and testing the site, but we have to give a report, and what that looks like, I think it's kind of up to us. And we've had success. There's a number of different tools that we've used, but that again I still feel like it's more of like, yep, here's section 508, here's all the rules for that, we're good. But the Virgin Atlantic or Virgin America example doesn't mean it actually works, right? So how deliberate do you want to be about accessibility? Do you just want to check the box 508, we passed the test, or do you really want to make your site accessible? And I think at least start at 508, right? Start with those rules, make it at least check all the boxes, and then maybe work yourself into actually testing it with keyboard. So it is possible. If you're going to check the box, it is possible just to add it to automated scripts if you're doing that, and being able to quickly check that if you're not going to use screen readers and not use keyboard. But again, I think that you're kind of doing a disservice, right? But it's a starting point. So anyone who's more interested in accessibility, I think please start somewhere, right? Start at the baseline and work your way up. And nationwide, we've been very deliberate. We're saying we're not just going to check the box. We're going to purchase JAWS, we're going to get MBDA, we're going to have accessibility experts, we're going to do lunch and learns, and disseminate accessibility across the enterprise. So it becomes sort of embedded and part of our culture. Yeah. Yeah, so we've had some challenges where let's say a new big project's coming up, right? And we're gonna have this agile team work on it, and we'll typically at the beginning, before the project gets started, we'll have a lunch and learn, right? And we'll have a big presentation, not that dissimilar from what I've done, but more in depth, right? Lots of code, lots of resources. The problem that we found with that is that we'll give that presentation in like I0 or I0 iteration 0 -1, something along those lines, and it's easy to forget, right? You get into the rhythm of things, and if you don't have reoccurring checkpoints, so I would say that that I think that as requirements are getting written, decide whose requirement is who's going to own it, right? Is business going to say, hey, I'm giving you money? It's my requirement. I'm going to make sure that, maybe because of a state requirement, you're going to be audited. So business, we're going to get in trouble if we don't meet accessibility. I feel like it would be most successful if it's in the IT requirements. And I said some projects we added to every single story card, making sure that it's accessible. But then have reoccurring checkpoints with the team. If you can have someone embedded, like I said, we only have a handful of people that really know accessibility really well, and we have thousands of developers, right? A huge IT organization. And so I'm not saying we're perfect, right, but we're being deliberate about it. I think that that's a huge first step, is you can be deliberate about accessibility, and you say that, something that recently just came out is our IT leadership said, not only external facing websites, but also internal. Every single website that we build will be accessible, right? So that's huge. Being very deliberate from the leadership of IT to say that we're going to be very deliberate about accessibility and make sure that everyone has the tools to succeed, right? You just don't want to make that requirement and then good luck. But I think that teams need to be reminded continuously. If adding it to story cards helps, if your test lead is really about accessibility, I think that would be awesome. And there's a number of different ways that you could go about it. Yeah. Yeah, so what was your, I'm sorry, so person. And still consider yourself AA, is that kind of what you're saying? So, I mean, I think that what you see is that some of the requirements are very deliberate, right? And so that HTML code sniffer really helps with that, around differentiating between errors and warnings, because there are some things that we just can't check through technology, right? And so I think that there are very clear-cut answers to a lot of those. And so, I mean, one thing that we strive to do is, we sort of identify the HTML code sniffer sort of not as the de facto checker, right? Because, I mean, we're still trying to actually make sure our sites are usable, but we're using that, and the goal is that, that our websites are at 0 errors. And it's hard to look at the number of, warnings or these things like, make sure to check this. I see that you're using this. Make sure that you're doing this. Those are things that they can't literally check for. So, I mean, I think that you need to get yourself down to 0 errors and then identify the warnings. So it may not be 100%, right? But there's a number of clear-cut requirements that you need to be able to meet in order to meet those requirements. Yeah.
How important do you think it is to talk through the plan in the beginning, reminding yourself throughout versus just relying on testing, relying on guidelines?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that we, I think that we're sort of guilty of being a little lazy as well. That we will see, I think kind of training your eye a little bit during the design process as you work and you be more deliberate about accessibility. That obviously early on, but that first mock-up that's made, right, the homepage, let's say, right, and you look at it, and pretty quickly, I mean, I found myself, right away, the second I look at it, yeah, great design, that's not going to meet color contrast requirements, and you can almost, you can't be sure you want to run it through a test. But you start to train your eye to be able to see that. And if you look at tiny little buttons that are, this close together, someone with motor disability who isn't using that, may not have exactness with the mouse. Maybe they're still using a mouse, but they're shaky, right? The thing that frustrates me is those big menus that have the hover and then expands out, and you have to keep your mouse exactly in the right hit target area or it turns off, right? And I'm using a mouse and I know what I'm doing. So I think that having a plan and design helps. We don't get too much into the details around, because I mean that's really the creative technologist. That's really being very deliberate, and we create those components. We go through and we're very deliberate about checking each component. But we've had problems where we gave them those forms. We've given that to the dev team, and they like saw those ARIA tags and they had no idea what they were. Delete, right? They had no idea what they were. They were Java developers. They didn't understand what we were trying to do. We didn't do a good job communicating to them the importance of these things that we were trying to do. And so I think that, so what we ended up having to do is have our accessibility guys sit with the dev team for about a week and just go through the entire application and clean it up. So there's things like that, worst case scenario, but at least we caught it. So we thought we were in the clear. We designed it with intent. We developed the component with intent, and we handed it off to the dev team. They didn't understand it. They didn't understand what we were trying to accomplish, and it kind of fell apart. but we were able to come back around at the end, and testing didn't catch it, right? Because we didn't have that as a requirement. So sometimes it depends on what's the nature of your IT department. If you have an IT department, and not that they're lazy, but they just don't understand, and you have to repeatedly stress the importance of accessibility. That's why making it a requirement, I think, really helps. Anything else? One more question. Yeah, one more question. Yeah. Yeah. So we used to do more of it. Unfortunately, I found a usability report from, I want to say it was a previous iteration, nationwide.com, and we brought it in, and I think that we need to do more of it. I think that we have the resources to do it. We have I think that recruiting can be a little challenging, right? But we have huge organization. We have a number of sight impaired employees, right? And we have done a little bit more of the guerrilla thing, but not intentionally. And I think that the number of projects that flow through nationwide, it's kind of hard. I think we kind of have to choose which ones we want to really take. But I think that it can be sort of agnostic. I don't think it has to be nationwide.com. Like it can be, it doesn't have to be project specific, right? Just pick something and just observe what they're doing. And so, the best case, absolutely, you're bringing in someone with very, maybe 2 to 3 different people with different disabilities to be able to test. If you can do that, you have the resources to do it, awesome. Like Nationwide even struggles to do that. And so I think that if you're able to at least observe someone with a few different disabilities and how they use screen readers, the way that I test it with a screen reader is in no way how they actually use it, right? And so there's a number of conferences. Someone from Nationwide speaking. There's a big accessibility conference in San Diego coming up in March, and he's actually speaking at it. And that's an awesome, if you're able to go to a conference just once, like in your one person from a company, make it deliver instead of going to, Breaking Development or Event Apart, go to an accessibility conference and bring back that knowledge and share it with the group, because all of those presentations are completely focused on technology and accessibility. So, they're not super expensive. I don't think they're $3,000 or $4,000 like a lot of these big conferences. And it's San Diego in March, so it might be a little bit. But if you could send one person from your company to go out there and bring back that knowledge and share it, I think it'd be a huge win. So. All right.
And for Brian. I feel really bad about your voice because.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, we can.
I can hear you back.
All right, good. Awesome.
But thank you. And thanks again for everyone coming out. I know everyone's super crazy busy, and trying to get some people to still go out. There's a handful of you that I feel like I've never met in my life. So if you're still looking to go out and have a good time, get some more drinks, trying to get people to go over to Bar Louie, which is just right down the street. So actually, if you go down, it's on Front Street.
It's next to
the North Market. So if you want to come out, get some drinks, meet some people, that's where I'm trying to get everyone else to go. So hopefully you decide to come and hang out. Anything else?
One final quote. We got one final quote from Kevin, which he says all the time. So let's party.
But thanks for coming out. And there's still some extra pizza, so try to eat some more.
Thank you. I feel like we owe you like a cup of tea or like a bottle of whiskey or something.
This is so frustrating that it's not sore.
Yeah. We can hear you in the back. Yeah, probably. Sort of like stuff. Could you hear me?